This program contains graphic material, including offensive language. Viewer discretion is advised.
A woman is murdered as her granddaughter looks on.
This was not a killing as much as it was a slaughter.
The girl's uncle is accused of the crime.
I had no qualms going into that trial about the guilt of that man.
The only evidence is from the child.
I would not want to go to prison based on the testimony of a 6-year-old girl.
Convicted and sentenced to life behind bars. American justice is there as he fights for his freedom.
No one deserves to be wrongly convicted.
This is the story of one man struggled for justice against what seemed to be insurmountable odds. In 1999, Clarence Elkins was found guilty of the rape and murder of his mother-in-law and the rape of his 6-year-old niece. His conviction was based on the testimony of the little girl. Elkins long proclaimed his innocence. His case was helped when his niece recanted her statements and new evidence surfaced that pointed to another possible suspect. But it wasn't until Elkins took matters into his own hands that he would get his best chance to clear his name. On this episode of American Justice, through exclusive interviews and dramatic courtroom testimony, we take you inside the emotionally charged battle to win his freedom.
It's absolutely wrong to be here sitting in jail for someone else's crime.
December 2004. Clarence Elkins is in prison for rape and murder.
I thought it was a joke, but I found out later that day in 1998 that it wasn't a joke.
He has maintained his innocence since the day of his arrest. Most of his family has never wavered in their support.
We've been through enough. It's time for it to be over. Justice needs to be served.
In the fall of 2004, after 6 years in prison, new DNA tests were conducted, showing no tie between Clarence Elkins and the brutal crimes. He was granted a hearing, giving him the chance to prove that he deserves a new trial.
I'm feeling elated, scared. I can't even put it into words how I feel today.
This hearing will determine whether Elkins' quest to clear his name will finally come to an end.
I'm just hoping that, praying that the truth will come out.
Elkins' story began in the early morning of June 7th, 1998, in the Akron, Ohio suburb of Barberton.
Hi, I'm not here right now. Just leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Bye.
I'm sorry to tell you this, but my grandma died, and I need somebody to get my mom for me. I'm all alone. Somebody get hold of my grandma. Now, please, would you get a hold of me as soon as you can? Bye.
This disturbing message was left by a 6-year-old girl at the home of a family friend. Just minutes after making the call, the child, who had spent the night at her grandmother's, knocked on a neighbor's door. There was blood on her nightgown. Her face was bruised and swollen. She told the neighbor who answered that someone had killed her grandmother. When pressed, the child reportedly said it was Uncle Clarence. The neighbor immediately drove the girl home, a few minutes across town. Her mother and father were asleep inside.
I heard tremendous banging, and I go to the door and I open it, and there stands my daughter in my mom's nightgown, covered from head to toe in blood. I looked at her, and I didn't even get to say anything. She said, "Mammal's dead." And I said, "What?" She said, "Mammal's dead. She's in front of the couch."
Stunned, April Sutton wanted to know who had done it.
She said, "Someone." And I said, "Who?" She said, "Clarence."
Sutton figured out her daughter was referring to her brother-in-law, Clarence Elkins, who was married to her sister Melinda.
And she told me that, and I was just like, I could not believe it. I mean, I could not believe it.
April took her daughter inside. The girl's father rushed back to her grandmother's house. And there, he found a grisly scene.
911, what's your emergency?
Yes. My mother-in-law's been stabbed. My little girl spent the night here, and the neighbor just brought her home and said that my mother-in-law was laying on the floor dead, and I come up here and she's laying here on the floor.
Okay, sir, just calm down. We're sending some help to you, okay?
Oh my God!
What's that?
She's dead!
110 West Summer Street.
The coroner would later determine that Judy Johnson had been beaten repeatedly with a blunt object and strangled. She had also been raped and sodomized, possibly with the same blunt object. 58-year-old Judy Johnson was pronounced dead at the scene. Police questioned Johnson's friends and family, including her granddaughter. When American Justice first spoke with the child, she was 11. Her mother requested that she remain anonymous. The girl told us she often spent time with her grandmother, whom she called Mamaw.
She was my babysitter, so I went there after school and I stayed the night a lot. We just watched TV and played dice and stuff.
The girl said that the night before the murder, she and her grandmother had attended a birthday party. Afterwards, they decided the girl should sleep over.
We went back to my grandma's house and we watched her favorite show and then we went to bed.
The coroner estimated that the murder had taken place sometime between 2:30 and 5:30 a.m. At the hospital, doctors determined that the child, like her grandmother, had been raped with a blunt object. She had also been strangled, beaten, and apparently left for dead. The doctors and police questioned the girl about who had done this. She reported, quote, she didn't see, but then said, Uncle Clarence. When asked how she knew it was her uncle, she responded it looked like him. Armed with the 6-year-old's statements, 2.5 hours after the crime was reported, police drove to the home of Clarence Elkins. When the deputy sheriff's car pulled into the driveway, Elkins went outside and was put in handcuffs.
I was totally shocked. I didn't know what was going on. And I said I would do anything I could to help.
Meanwhile, an officer told Elkins' wife, Melinda, about her mother's death.
His comment to me was, we got a report from Barberton Police Department that Clarence Elkins' mother-in-law has been stabbed in her home. And I said, is she okay? And he said, no, ma'am. She's been murdered.
For Melinda, that piece of news was immediately followed by another stunning revelation.
When I learned that my niece was saying that it was him, I just thought something weird is happening here, and I couldn't comprehend.
Elkins was taken to the Barberton Police Department and placed under arrest. Melinda called her sister April to try to find out what was going on.
I was trying to tell my sister that he was at home. April, come on, Clarence.
In my heart, I didn't believe Clarence did it, but being a mother, you have to believe your children, so.
5 days later, the two sisters attended their mother's funeral. They sat together for the service.
I held her hand, she held mine, and we walked away from one another, still holding hands. I remember that because it just felt so final. She said goodbye, and I said goodbye.
They would not speak again for 3.5 years. 36-year-old Clarence Elkins was charged with rape and aggravated murder, which meant in Ohio he was eligible for the death penalty. Prosecutors were confident that they had the right man.
I was convinced after reviewing the evidence, and especially after speaking with the child and her psychologist, that he was guilty.
Elkins' wife Melinda and many others remain certain that he was innocent. We'll tell you why in a moment.
I think the Barberton police had what they felt was an open and shut case. A little girl who saw her uncle kill her grandmother. What more do you need?
The 1998 murder of Judy Johnson in her Barberton, Ohio home was an all-encompassing tragedy for her family. Johnson's 6-year-old granddaughter had also been a victim, raped with a blunt object. Judy's son-in-law, Clarence Elkins, had been arrested and charged with the crime. The sole witness, his niece, told police Uncle Clarence did it. Authorities tried to corroborate the girl's statements. More than 100 items of evidence from the crime scene were collected, including blood and hair samples. DNA tests were run on many of the items. Of what was tested, nothing matched Clarence Elkins. Similarly, nothing incriminating turned up in a search of the Elkins home, just a few hours after the crime. Despite the lack of physical evidence, prosecutors say the statements from the little girl were enough to convince them that Elkins was the man responsible for the crime.
We met with the child many times, and I just had an opportunity to get to know her and talk to her, and she convinced me. She was diagnosed and treated by psychologists because of this horrible thing that happened to her. They also were convinced that she knew what happened, was telling the truth, and obviously could easily identify her uncle as the man who did this.
But Elkins' wife Melinda says there is no way Clarence could have committed such a violent crime.
Clarence is the kind of person that worked in the garden and did the yard work on the weekends.
The family concedes that Clarence and his mother-in-law did not always get along. For one thing, his relationship with his wife had been stormy from the moment they were married. High school sweethearts, the two wed in 1980 when they were 18 years old.
I think that because we were so young when we got married that we basically grew up together and learned together.
Everybody, has their good times and their bad times. So, I don't think it was any marriage out of the normal,
But the couple fought often, and after they had 2 sons, the stresses of child rearing didn't make it any easier. To cope, it was not uncommon for them to separate for days at a time.
She'd come and stay at my mom's house until things smoothed over, or till Clarence came to see if she was going to come home. Probably once a year, I would say.
Melinda admits that her mother's view of Clarence was colored by these separations.
The negativity came through the years of Clarence and I arguing all the time. I was her daughter, so of course she was on my side.
Him and my sister had been physical a couple times, and that's what really a couple times changed my mom's feelings about him.
But Elkins says this animosity never approached a level where he would seek to hurt, much less rape and kill, his mother-in-law.
Me and Judy did not have no arguments out of the ordinary or disagreements out of the ordinary.
Even if there were issues with his mother-in-law, Elkins had a good relationship with his niece.
My daughter really liked Clarence a lot. She always used to want to go and stay the night down there.
She loved to be around my family, my sons, and myself. I treated her as if she was my own child.
Elkins and his family say he had no motive to commit the crime, and more importantly, no opportunity. According to Clarence and Melinda Elkins, they were at home, 40 miles away during the critical hours of the morning when the attack took place. Elkins had spent the previous day drinking beer and doing chores.
I had probably drank 8 or 10 beers throughout that day, off and on.
That night, Elkins continued his drinking at several local bars. A number of people say they saw him until 2:30 a.m., around the time his wife claims he arrived home. Melinda says she was up because their son was ill. She said her husband was awake for about 45 minutes.
He probably went to bed about 3:15, you know, if you want to be more specific, between 3:15 and 3:30. I was still awake.
Melinda adds that she remained up with her son the rest of the night, dozing only for a few minutes at a time, and that she saw her husband in bed several times before morning. She says there is no way that her husband could have left for the 2 hours it would have taken him to drive to her mother's house, murder her, and come back.
If he would have left the house, I'm sure I would have noticed he had a dog outside that barked at anything.
There's just no way I could have gotten out of my home without someone noticing. There's no way.
Despite Elkins' alibi, as his trial approached, his defense attorney knew he would face a major challenge: the testimony of Elkins' niece.
There was absolutely no other evidence that they could rely upon to link Clarence to this murder. The only source of evidence was this young child.
There is not a chance that the child can be wrong. She knew what happened, knew what she saw, and knew who did it.
The brutality of the crime was too much to bear, let alone for them to be accusing Clarence of something so horrible.
In 1998 in Barberton, Ohio, Judy Johnson was murdered, and her 6-year-old granddaughter was sexually assaulted. The accused? The girl's uncle, Clarence Elkins.
I thought, well, you know, we'll get our chance to prove that he's innocent.
The trial began on May 20th, 1999, in Akron, Ohio. The state was seeking the death penalty. Prosecutors began by laying out Elkins' motive. He wanted his mother-in-law to stay out of his troubled marriage. The state argued that on the night of the crime, in a drunken rage, Elkins drove 40 miles to Johnson's home and murdered her.
Judy Johnson, I don't want to use the word hate, but strongly disliked Clarence Elkins, and he strongly disliked her. So we thought that was the reason for the animosity, coupled with the drinking of that night, causes him to go to the house and kill her, not expecting that the child would be there. I think he was totally surprised that the child was there.
The child was the sole eyewitness to the crime. She was also the state's star witness. On May 27th, prosecutors called the 7-year-old girl to the stand. The girl testified that it was her Uncle Clarence who had killed her grandmother. She also said that he had, quote, punched me in the cheek. During his cross-examination, defense attorney Lawrence Whitney pointed out that the first time the child had the opportunity to make an identification, this answering machine message,
I'm all alone.
she didn't do so.
Somebody killed my grandma.
The defense argued that the girl didn't know who had attacked her, and only later latched on to her uncle.
There's a lot of debate about, you know, what she said. She said somebody hurt my grandmother, then it became somebody who looked like my Uncle Clarence hurt my grandmother, and then it was Uncle Clarence did it.
Under redirect, the prosecution simply drove home their point, asking the child again if she was sure it was her Uncle Clarence. She replied, yes. Questioned as to how she knew, the child responded, because of his face. The girl's testimony formed the core of the state's case, and once she finished, the prosecution rested. It was now the defense's turn. Their strategy was to focus on the complete lack of physical evidence implicating Clarence Elkins.
This was not a killing as much as it was a slaughter. Anyone participating there in such a crime would have had blood all over this person. They checked Clarence's home, checked all the drains, checked the car, did everything they could do to find some blood somewhere, and found none.
What's more, DNA tests indicated that none of the evidence matched Clarence Elkins. On June 3rd, 1999, the jury began deliberations. Juror Roger Owen says the conversation kept coming back to one thing.
It all bared on the little girl's testimony. She put him there. I mean, that's what it was based on. It all came down to her. That statement that her uncle heard her in the bedroom was a lasting one.
After 14 hours of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict.
We came into that courtroom, you could cut the tension with a knife. Once the verdict was given, we first said not guilty of aggravated murder, and you had thought almost like you were at a football game because of the cheering.
The shouts of Elkins' supporters were quickly silenced. The jury, it turned out, had compromised.
And when it was guilty on murder, it was just the most piercing scream that I've ever heard.
Clarence looked at me, and he shook his head, and he put his head down on the table. And he was crying. And it about killed me.
2 weeks later, the judge gave Elkins the maximum possible sentence. Life in prison.
The whole thing was a nightmare. It still is. And I still have to pinch myself and wonder if I'm really awake.
After Elkins' conviction, his wife Melinda recruited a new defense team to help fight the appeals.
The goal is to find who murdered my mother and to have Clarence released from prison.
Melinda contacted Martin Yant, a 30-year veteran investigator who specializes in wrongful convictions.
Of all the cases I've interviewed, I have had very few that I've felt as strongly about someone's innocence as this one.
One of the first things Yant began looking into was the question, if Clarence Elkins didn't commit the crime, who did? Melinda Elkins had a suspect in mind, a 27-year-old man named Ryle Rush. Rush had lived near Judy Johnson at the time of her murder and had reportedly had a crush on the older woman. When investigator Yant interviewed Rush, he noticed that Rush bore a resemblance to Clarence Elkins. It was a promising development, but to make real progress, Yant would need the help of Elkins' niece. So in the fall of 2001, he convinced Melinda to reconcile with her sister April, the little girl's mother.
I missed her, of course. You know, when you have a tragedy like that, you want to be around your family members, and I just felt empty. But what brought us back together was she never gave up hope. She always said that it was someone else.
The sisters' renewed relationship led April to at least consider whether her daughter really knew who had attacked her. A few months later, April showed a photo of Ryle Rush to her daughter.
When my sister and I showed my daughter the picture of Ryle, you can't imagine it. She just, like, busted into tears. She was screaming at the top of her lungs. I'll never forget those eyes. And I was like, oh my God. It made me believe that it was really Ryle.
In January 2002, 3.5 years after the attack, the girl, now 10 years old, recanted her earlier testimony in a taped deposition set up by the defense team.
Why, if you even know, why did you say it was Uncle Clarence?
Because it looked like him.
It looked like him. But do you think it was Uncle Clarence?
At first, yeah.
At first, yeah. But do you think so today?
No.
In May 2002, armed with an alternate suspect and the sole witness's recantation, the defense submitted a petition to the court arguing that Elkins deserved a new trial. Prosecutors fought the move.
The recantation occurs suddenly, and at least in my opinion, after contact with Melinda Elkins. She had a lot of family pressure on the child did to change her story or doubt what she said. I believe it was coerced.
The court agreed, and in December 2002, Elkins' petition for an evidentiary hearing was denied. Undeterred, the Elkins family fired their lawyer and later retained a new attorney, Jenna DeLoach. 2 months after the ruling, prosecutors unexpectedly called the defense and offered a DNA sample from Ryle Rush in order to eliminate him as a suspect once and for all.
The things they have said about him, there's just no connection between that man and this homicide. None.
Ryle Rush publicly stated he had nothing to do with Judy Johnson's death and willingly provided samples for testing. Both sides would now wait for the results.
My mother's death is still being mocked by Barberton police.
In June 2003, on the 5th anniversary of her mother's murder, Melinda Elkins organized a rally on her husband's behalf. In attendance was her then 11-year-old niece, who took this moment to go fully public with her story.
The reason I'm here today is to support my Uncle Clarence and my grandma. I want everyone to understand that I was not told to say that it was someone else.
Personally, I just pray that she's telling the truth. As a juror, I stand by our decision, by the evidence that was brought forth in the trial. If, the powers or the legal system feels he needs a new trial because of it, then, he should have a new trial.
Whether or not Elkins would get a new trial would soon be determined. Up next, a new DNA test is conducted on the crime scene evidence with surprising results.
I don't give up hope. One way I was raised is to believe in the truth and stand up for the truth.
In April 2004, convicted murderer Clarence Elkins had been fighting for almost 5 years to win a new trial. Now it seemed his best chance at uncovering new evidence was at hand. DNA profiles of Elkins and an alternate suspect named Ryle Rush had been sent by the defense team to Orchid Cellmark Labs in Dallas, Texas. Here, the profiles would be tested against evidence recovered from murder victim Judy Johnson and from her granddaughter, Brooke, who survived the attack. First, the evidence was subjected to YSTR, a new DNA test that only became available in the fall of 2002.
It is a male-specific test, so it will only examine male DNA. YSTRs are much more powerful in their ability to exclude a suspect than they are in their ability to include a suspect.
When the tests came back, they revealed male DNA on several items of evidence, including Johnson's fingernails, Brooke's panties, and a vaginal swab taken from Johnson. Technicians then compared the DNA to that of Clarence Elkins and Ryle Rush. The results, according to the lab, were unmistakable.
Clarence Elkins was excluded from all the items of evidence that we tested. Ryle Rush was also excluded as a contributor.
The exclusion of their alternate suspect came as a surprise to Elkins' supporters. Still, they believe they had enough new evidence to clear Elkins, and his defense team petitioned the court for a chance to present the findings. A judge agreed and set the date for December 1st, 2004. It's the morning of the hearing. Clarence Elkins is at the Summit County Jail, preparing to be transported to court. American justice is there for what Elkins hopes will be his final steps towards freedom.
This hearing date today is it's an emotional day for me. At the same time, I can't get too excited, even though I want to be.
Good afternoon. You may be seated. Since this is indeed defendant's motion, Ms. Deloach would proceed first.
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court. Your Honor, we are asserting that the Barberton Police Department arrested an innocent man. Mr. Elkins has been wrongfully imprisoned ever since.
Attorney Deloach explains why the evidence that has been uncovered is both new and relevant.
Because we have YSTR testing now. All that looks for is male DNA. It won't find any DNA if male DNA is not there. But it did find male DNA. And, Your Honor, it was not Clarence Elkins.
Prosecutor Michael Carroll counters that Elkins' murder conviction was never based on forensics, but instead on eyewitness testimony. When questioned by the judge, Carroll readily concedes that the original testing of physical evidence never linked Elkins to the crime.
What were the precise results at trial?
I'll give you the bottom line of all of the testing. Nothing included Clarence Elkins. The physical evidence, the forensic evidence did not include him. That this is not a case based on the forensics, it's a case based on the testimony of the child victim.
Well, same question.
The prosecution goes on to argue that the sole purpose of the new DNA tests conducted by the defense was to determine whether Ryle Rush could be physically tied to the crime. The DNA comparisons ruled Rush out as a suspect. The fact that the results also excluded Clarence Elkins, Carroll tells the judge, is irrelevant.
Is it not significant that no comparison to Ryle Rush was made and no comparison to this defendant?
No, it's significant that no comparison was made to Ryle Rush, but the evidence at the trial did not make a comparison to this man.
And you are about out of time, sir, so why don't you wrap up your thinking for me if you have anything further. And I
wrapped it up, Your Honor. The only thing I want you to do is consider that the purpose of this testing was to see if Ryle Rush is the murderer rapist. He is not, and this motion should be denied.
Your Honor, I believe totally that we've met our burden. The evidence that identified the rapist of Judith Johnson was not detectable at the time of trial. They're a dog with a bone, and they don't want to let it go. We have an innocent man sitting here in this chair who's been in prison for 6.5 years, and it's wrong. They need to give it up.
All right. Thank you, counsel. I'll duly deliberate, take this matter under advisement, and issue my ruling as soon as possible. Court's adjourned.
The whole point of this exercise was to show that Ryle Rush did this, and they couldn't do it, so they want to now take these results and use them for something else.
I think my attorney done a wonderful job. And I know it will just get better if need be. And I have all the confidence in the world in it.
I feel like it went well. Obviously, I wanted him to come home today, but I think that's coming soon.
Up next, the judge hands down her decision, and the Elkins case takes another unexpected and dramatic turn. Should there be national guidelines governing the use of child testimony? You tell us at aetv.com. December 2004. Clarence Elkins supporters are anxiously awaiting Judge Judy Hunter's decision on whether new DNA evidence in his case warrants a closer look. After 27 days, Judge Hunter hands down her ruling. Clarence Elkins is granted an evidentiary hearing. The challenge for the defense now will be to win him a new trial.
Good morning. Please be seated.
March 2005. Elkins' lawyers must prove to the judge that their evidence would have created reasonable doubt at the original trial, resulting in a different verdict.
I will be presenting evidence and testimony on behalf of Mr. Elkins with respect to chain of custody. With that, Your Honor, I will turn the podium over to Professor Godsey, and he will address the court with respect to the DNA issues.
Mr. Godsey.
May it please the court, my name is Mark Godsey. I'm going to talk about what the DNA today is going to show. In a nutshell, of the items that were tested from the crime scene, there were 4 items that had male DNA on them. This male DNA was not the DNA of Clarence Elkins. In this case, the only direct eyewitness testimony is from a 6-year-old girl who was under extreme trauma at the time, who made identification in the dark. And in light of this new evidence, we need to have a jury look at this case again, and what we're asking for is a new trial. Thank you, Your Honor.
It falls to Prosecutor Michael Carroll to convince the judge that the test results are irrelevant to the case. Carroll reminds the court that Elkins was convicted through the eyewitness testimony of his niece, Brooke Sutton. According to the state, whatever DNA may have been found and tested did not belong to the killer.
It is clear from the testimony in that trial that Brooke Sutton said one person committed this crime and only one. The person in the kitchen was Uncle Clarence. The person in the bedroom attacking her was Uncle Clarence. So what are we talking about? What we're talking about is DNA not connected to this crime.
Thank you, counsel. And so now...
We would like to call our first witness, Your Honor.
You may.
Clarence Elkins calls Cassie Johnson.
Forensic analyst Cassie Johnson explains to the court the significance of the new DNA testing process used in the Elkins case.
Could you explain the purpose of Y chromosome testing is, what advantages it has over other forms of testing?
Y chromosome testing is a male-specific DNA test, and it's used in instances where there might be an overwhelming amount of female DNA and only a very small amount of male DNA.
Johnson goes on to say that the male DNA found on the evidence did not match Clarence Elkins. But under cross-examination, the prosecution attacks the condition of the evidence tested, implying that it had somehow been contaminated.
And do you do anything with the slide holders in your testing?
No, I simply know that they were sealed, and I didn't do anything further with them.
Then the brown paper, you describe it as unsealed?
Yes, it was unsealed, but it was folded when I received it.
Then, in an unorthodox move, Prosecutor Carroll picks up the evidence with his bare hands.
And contained in the brown paper are the pink panties.
I would request that gloves be put on when handling the evidence.
I'll take the chance. These are the pink panties, right?
I object too. Would you put those back in there? And if we're going to handle evidence, we're going to do it with gloves on.
Well, I guess that's my point. At the time of the trial, do you know this, that these items were opened and handled by people at the trial?
I'm unaware what happened or what occurred with the items of evidence prior to their arrival at Orchid Sunlight.
Okay.
Your Honor, we'd like to call Dr. Rick Staub.
Okay.
The defense immediately responds by calling to the stand the DNA lab director. He tells the court that another bag of evidence containing the victim's fingernails arrived at the lab in the original envelope, sealed the day of the murder.
The evidence tape was intact when we got it. Therefore, this evidence had not been opened since 6/8/98 until Cassie Johnson opened it in our laboratory in 2004.
No further questions.
Mr. Carroll, cross-examination?
You're not telling us that that DNA is connected to this crime at all, are you?
All I'm saying is that we examined evidence that was sealed from the crime. Whether the DNA is actually from the crime itself, I can't say.
That's all I have, Your Honor.
Your Honor, I just have a couple questions.
On redirect, the defense seizes the opportunity to hammer home the crux of its argument.
Dr. Staub, we discussed the fact that it can't make a conclusive match. Just to be clear, can YSTR officially exclude people?
Absolutely.
And was Clarence Elkins excluded from all of the biological evidence in this case?
Yes, Clarence Elkins was excluded from every piece of evidence that we examined in this case.
After a full day and a half of testimony, both sides make their final plea to the judge.
I submit to you that all these things have been tested, given the locations where they're tested. That is enough by itself, the fact that Clarence Elkins has been conclusively excluded here, to grant him a new trial.
What's been presented here will have no effect on the outcome of this trial because it is not relevant and it's not material because the DNA testing, the DNA is not connected to the crime.
With that, the hearing comes to an end. Clarence Elkins' fate is now in the hands of the judge.
They contend that this DNA is relevant to this crime. We say it is not.
We've presented sufficient evidence that would give the judge plenty of gas to grant our motion for new trial.
From 7 years ago to today, it still hurts the same. That's my mom.
I feel victory, total victory is nearing.
Days of waiting turn into weeks, then months. Finally, Judge Hunter hands down her decision. Clarence Elkins' bid for a new trial is denied.
Our overall gut response was just total disbelief, very, very disappointed.
In my mind and spirit, I was ready for Clarence to walk out of there, and I really felt that that was going to happen. Okay. So,
Failing to convince the court of her husband's innocence, Melinda now focuses on finding the true culprits. And she has someone in mind. 32-year-old Earl Mann. Mann was Judy Johnson's neighbor at the time of her murder and is serving a sentence for child rape at the very same prison as Clarence Elkins. Seeing an opportunity to gather evidence that could link Earl Mann to the crime, in September 2005, Elkins retrieves a cigarette butt from Mann and sends it to his lawyers. The DNA from the butt is tested against DNA from the crime scene. The results reveal a close match. It is a long-awaited victory for Clarence Elkins.
When I got the results, there was nothing but tears of joy and praising the Lord, and just thinking this was it.
Though prosecutors publicly expressed doubts about the new evidence, they launch an investigation.
It concerned me because Earl Mann has a violent past. And when I started reading some prior police reports and some of his prior crimes, it was very disturbing.
Over the next 2 months, Mann fails 5 polygraph tests and makes several incriminating statements.
Earl Mann admitted being in the home with the victim, Judy Johnson, on the night of her murder. At that point, I felt there was clear and convincing evidence that Clarence Elkins was innocent.
Prosecutors, however, hold off taking any action. Then, in December 2005, another stunning development. A pubic hair recovered from the crime scene is conclusively linked to Earl Mann. Prosecutors now have little choice but to set Clarence Elkins free. December 15th, 2005. Ohio Attorney General Jim Petro, who has been publicly supportive of Elkins for the last 7 weeks, announces that the prosecution is ordering the release of Clarence Elkins later that day.
They will be petitioning for the immediate release of Clarence Elkins and dismissal of all charges.
We find out that they're ready to let him go as soon as we can get there, so it becomes this race. And there's bad weather, and it's snowing really hard, and the roads are really slick. And we met at the BP station, which is right near the prison, so we could all be together and go at the same time.
I actually got to break the news to him today. They allowed him to call the Attorney General's office, and I was able to tell him to pack his stuff. He's coming home today.
At 3:45 p.m., Clarence Elkins walks out of prison a free man after 7.5 years behind bars.
Beautiful day the Lord has made. I'm very proud of everyone that stepped forward on my behalf for justice. I thank God and everyone here.
This has been so hard on all of us, and seeing him walk out of there a free man, that was my whole entire goal this whole time. And he's out. He's free. Definitely need to do some Christmas shopping.
Clarence Elkins is now home.
It's been a difficult transition for him, as I'm sure it's going to take a lot of time. But just knowing that he's a free man, totally free, is amazing.
This is the best Christmas gift I could ever receive. Just to know that I can have the rest of my life with my family. That's the ultimate